Well, what we are seeing today is Iran being empowered by the Western democracies, coming stronger to the negotiations, continuing to strengthening Israel's right to exist. And we should be worried about that. I think what we saw in 2015 was bad for Israel. And what we are seeing today, it's even worse. We know that the negotiations will not lead to a serious agreement, a binding agreement that will actually prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear capabilities. We saw what they did in the last 5 years. You can just imagine what they will do now. We prefer that the world will not give the legitimacy to this regime. And yes, to go back to the sanctions regime, to think about other options. But, let's think about what happened with North Korea. They were playing the same game, negotiating, ceding the negotiations, coming back. And then one day they woke up and announced, we have nuclear capabilities. We don't want to be in that situation, and we shouldn't be that.
All right, Barbara, a lot to respond to there. I'll just let you pick it up.
Sure. With all due respect to the ambassador, the reason we're in this situation is because the Trump administration, at the strong urging of the Netanyahu government, quit the Iran nuclear deal unilaterally in 2018. Iran waited a year, and then it started to accelerate its nuclear program again. Iran was in compliance with the agreement at the time that Donald Trump pulled out. So I think it's a bit of chutzpah, to say the least, to be arguing this position now. The only way in which Iran's program has been verifiably curbed has been under a diplomatic agreement, a political agreement, and we would be lucky, all of us, and that especially includes Israel, to get back into the old agreement. Iran would have to get rid of huge stockpiles of low, medium, and even higher enriched uranium. It would have to mothball centrifuges and take a number of steps to improve cooperation with the IAEA. That would buy very precious time for change to occur within Iran, time for other changes to occur. I agree with the ambassador that Iran's anti-Israel rhetoric is despicable and certainly unhelpful. But as we all know, Israel has nuclear weapons, perhaps 90 or more nuclear warheads, and other means of defending itself. So, Iran's threats are really political. They're not realistic.
Well, Ambassador Dannon, do you agree that those threats is that the view from here in Israel, that those threats are not realistic and Israel will be lucky to go back into an agreement?
Absolutely not. History have taught us, Calev, that we cannot ignore a radical regime who is threatening the very existence of the Jewish people. And look what's happening on the borders of Israel. The proxies of Iran, they're getting billions of dollars coming from Tehran to promote instability, to promote terrorism. Imagine that they will be able to export not only the ideas of the revolution, but actually nuclear capabilities to the region. So it is a threat not only for us, it is a threat for the stability of the entire Middle East. And we know that we are dealing with a very dangerous regime, and we prefer that the world will not give them the kosher stamp to continue with what they are doing. That's why, together with our allies in the region, we are ready for all scenarios. We are not part of the negotiations. We are not part of the agreement, if there will be an agreement. I hope not. And we will keep our right to defend ourselves. That's what we have to do.
Right. Barbara, you could respond. But there are 2 points the ambassador raised specifically, if you could. One, the argument that any agreement with Iran is of little value if it doesn't address some of its other actions in the region. And the other is that, it's not just Israel. You look at Israel's new allies in the Gulf. They also share the same concerns about Iran and its nuclear deal and this agreement.
Yeah, well, the JCPOA was supposed to be the foundation for other talks about other issues. But because the U.S. quit it, because the U.S. violated the agreement, there was no prospect for talking about other issues. But the ambassador has put his finger on something important, which is that Iran's real threat to Israel is not a nuclear threat. It's a threat from groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, that get Iranian support. And unfortunately, I don't think those groups are going to give up their opposition to Israel as long as Israel continues its current policies toward the Palestinians and on other issues. But the nuclear program is still important. It's important to address. And I think that returning to this agreement, and I'm not alone in this, there are a lot of Israelis who agree with me, that getting back into the old deal would buy us precious time to deal with some of these other issues.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, she does raise the point that some other Israelis, not all on the left, have also said that maybe some kind of agreement would work. But she raised some other issues I'm sure you're going to want to respond to.
First, the threat for Israel, in the short run, yes, it's the proxies on the borders. But for the long run, it's nuclear Iran. It's a very serious threat. And we always have to think about the long run. Because yes, 5 years, 10 years, but it will come one day, and we will have to face the realities. Regarding what the Israelis, I heard so many times that the UN, during the year they served there, that yes, other voices in Israel think differently. We have a government in Israel. The previous government position was very clear against the Iran deal, and the current government position is very clear against the Iran deal as well. We heard today Prime Minister Bennett and Ministers Gantz and Lapid. So it has nothing to do with left or right. You see that the majority of the leaders of Israel are concerned about the weak position of the West while entering the negotiation. And I think we can count only on the Iranians, but they will have more demands than ever, that they will not see a bad deal coming out of Vienna.
Right. Let me ask you, Barbara, that he's saying even just the fact that the U.S. agreed to the terms set out by Iran. They're not actually a direct part of these negotiations. They're on the sidelines. Iran is making these demands that the sanctions be lifted before anything happens. It's even hard to see how progress can be made at this point.
Yeah, well, those are unrealistic demands, and the Iranians know that. I mean, this is a new administration in Iran, not a new regime, and one should expect some political posturing. I think it was very important for Iran that sanctions be discussed first, but they understand that there will be no relief of sanctions without a return to compliance with the nuclear aspects of the deal. Also, we should remember that Iran is not 10 feet tall. Its economy has been severely weakened by sanctions, by COVID, by mismanagement and corruption. This administration is not popular. There were demonstrations just over the weekend in Isfahan about water shortages. And so there is a considerable amount of leverage on the Western side as well. I would not call the U.S. or the Western position weak.
Well, what about that, Mr. Ambassador? She feels, Barbara seems to feel there is some leverage that the Western powers have. You might actually be in an agreement on that, but I think you're at odds about how that leverage should be applied.
Well, I think we can agree on one point, that we all pray for the Iranian people, that they will have a different regime. We see that they are suffering more than ever, and we hope that they will be able to become, members of the international community. But it will happen only a change of regime will take place in Iran. I think the Western democracies have a tendency to try to solve the problem, to do it fast. And in the Middle East, we have a different mentality. You do not solve the problem so fast. You have to be patient, and you have to deal with the Iranians and to speak with them in the language that they understand.
What about that, Barbara? Because the ambassador is raising a sort of point, and you do hear that, not just in Israel, in the region, that the U.S. always wants to have some kind of quick fix. And as we've seen, yes, elsewhere, and certainly in this region, a quick fix sometimes leads to a more risky situation.
This is not a quick fix. The JCPOA took 12 years to negotiate. Look, I think that there also may be a disagreement in terms of what might bring about change in Iran. I think that the JCPOA, the agreement bringing Iran into the international community, will be a better formula for change within the country. And I know from a fact from 9 visits to Iran that most Iranians are not against the state of Israel. This is government propaganda. So I think that it would be better to reduce tensions with Iran. This would be a much better way, and we can do that through this agreement. And then perhaps we can see some other positive steps in terms of Iran's evolution and its attitudes toward Israel and other states. May I just say that I have a great deal of faith in Israel's ability to defend itself, and we have seen that Israeli intelligence has thoroughly penetrated the Iranian program. So even if Iran were to go for a bomb, I don't think they'd get there. We've seen a lot of measures that Israel has taken that have impeded Iran's progress, although has not stopped it.
All right. Well, Mr. Ambassador, you might agree about the Iranian people there, but certainly the whole issue of engaging Iran rather than isolating it is certainly maybe a fundamental disagreement between you.
Absolutely. I think we should isolate the regime, apply pressure. We know that it actually affected them, the fact they couldn't fly, they couldn't use their currency, and they suffered. And that's why they moved a little bit. I think we should have more pressure, more leverage on them. And I would add one more point. Yes, Israel is capable of dealing with the threat of Iran, but it should not be our sole responsibility to do that. We do expect the international community to take steps, to listen to the inspectors who just came back from Tehran and said very clearly, we couldn't see anything. They didn't allow us to enter the sites we wanted to enter, and not to ignore the voices, not from Israel or the Middle East, or the international inspectors themselves.
Mr. Ambassador, I think we'll have to leave it there. And Barbara Slavin, I'm sorry, that will be the last word. But this discussion surely will continue. Thank you for joining us on The Rundown.